If I had known a single 911 call would turn the most powerful person in my neighborhood against me, I would have started paying a lot more attention to the people running our HOA. My name is Ryan Parker, and until that afternoon, I thought the biggest problem in our community was whether people left their trash cans out too long. That changed on a warm Tuesday just after 3 p.m. I was working from home when I noticed a serious situation unfolding near the entrance of our subdivision. At first, I assumed someone else had already reported it. Then a few more minutes passed, and nothing happened. The longer I watched, the more uncomfortable I became. Eventually, I did what I thought any reasonable person would do. I picked up my phone and called 911. The dispatcher asked a few questions, thanked me for reporting it, and told me help was on the way. I figured that was the end of my involvement. I was wrong. Less than 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the neighborhood. Several residents stepped outside to watch. Within minutes, people were talking, pointing, and trying to figure out what had happened. I went back to my desk and returned to work, assuming life would move on. Instead, my phone started buzzing. A neighbor texted me asking if I knew why police were in the community. Another asked if I had seen anything unusual. The attention felt strange, but not alarming. Then I received a message that immediately changed my mood. It was from Deborah Collins, the president of our HOA. Deborah rarely contacted residents directly unless there was a violation notice involved. Her message was short. "We need to talk." There was no explanation, no greeting, and no indication of what this was about. A few hours later, just after sunset, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Deborah was standing there. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't introducing herself. She looked like someone arriving to settle a score. Before I could ask what was going on, she asked whether I had called 911 earlier that day. The question caught me off guard. I told her the truth. Yes, I had. Her expression hardened immediately. What happened next made no sense to me at the time. Instead of asking whether everything was okay or thanking me for looking out for the neighborhood, she seemed angry that the call had been made at all. She told me that bringing police into the community created unnecessary attention. Then she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. She looked directly at me and said, "People who create problems here usually regret it." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. I laughed nervously and told her I wasn't trying to create problems. I had simply reported something that seemed important. But she didn't laugh. She didn't soften her tone. If anything, she seemed frustrated that I wasn't taking the warning seriously. After a few more tense moments, she turned around and walked back toward the sidewalk. I stood there watching her leave, trying to figure out what had just happened. I had made a routine emergency call in good faith, yet somehow the president of the HOA was treating me like I had crossed a line. As strange as that conversation felt, I still believed it would blow over by morning. I had no idea that this was only the beginning, and that Deborah Collins had already decided I was about to become her next target. The next morning, I woke up hoping the uncomfortable conversation with Deborah Collins had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. By 9 o'clock, that hope was gone. An email from the HOA appeared in my inbox with the subject line "Notice of Community Compliance Violation." At first, I assumed it had been sent by mistake. I opened it expecting some minor issue, maybe a lawn maintenance reminder or a parking question. Instead, the notice claimed that my property had violated multiple community appearance standards. According to the email, my trash container had been visible from the street beyond the approved time frame, my mailbox required maintenance, and decorative items on my front porch did not comply with HOA guidelines. The timing felt impossible. I had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 4 years and had never received a single violation notice. Now, less than 12 hours after Deborah warned me about creating problems, I suddenly had 3. I walked outside and looked around my property. The trash container was exactly where it had been for years. The mailbox looked the same as every other mailbox on the street. The decorations on my porch had been there since spring. Nothing had changed except one thing. I had called 911. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the connection. Still, I tried to be rational. Maybe another board member had submitted the violations. Maybe the timing was a coincidence. I responded politely and asked for clarification. A few hours later, I received a reply from Deborah herself. She informed me that the violations had been personally reviewed and approved. No additional explanation was provided. That afternoon, I started noticing something else. Neighbors who usually waved as they walked past my house seemed unusually distant. One man who normally stopped to chat with me about football barely acknowledged me. A woman across the street looked away the moment our eyes met. It was subtle, but it was happening. Something in the neighborhood had shifted. Around dinner time, I received another message from a resident I knew casually. The message was brief. "You really upset the board." I stared at the screen, confused. I asked what he meant. Several minutes passed before he replied. "People are saying you brought police here over nothing." My stomach dropped. Suddenly, pieces started falling into place. The story spreading through the neighborhood was not the same story I had lived through. Somehow, the focus was no longer on the situation that led me to call for help. The focus had become me. Later that evening, I logged into the HOA resident portal. Buried among routine announcements was a notice for a special community meeting scheduled the following week. The stated purpose was to discuss recent concerns affecting neighborhood harmony. The phrase seemed oddly specific. Then I noticed something else. Deborah was listed as the meeting presenter. I had a feeling I knew exactly who those concerns were going to involve. Before going to bed, I checked my email one last time. Another HOA message had arrived. This time it informed me that failure to correct the listed violations could result in financial penalties. Less than 24 hours after Deborah stood on my doorstep, the pressure was already escalating. What bothered me most was not the possibility of fines. It was the realization that someone seemed determined to make me regret a decision that I still believed had been the right one. By the end of the week, the violation notices had become impossible to ignore. What started as a single email turned into a steady stream of warnings, reminders, and compliance deadlines. Every time I opened my inbox, there seemed to be another message waiting for me. The strange part was that none of the issues were things anyone had ever mentioned before. One notice claimed that a section of my lawn was inconsistent with community standards. Another questioned the placement of a flower pot near my front door. A third suggested that exterior items visible from the street required review. Individually, each complaint sounded minor. Together, they felt deliberate. I spent an entire Saturday morning walking around my property with a copy of the HOA guidelines. The more I compared the rules to what existed throughout the neighborhood, the more confused I became. Houses up and down the street had similar decorations, similar landscaping, and similar layouts. Yet I seemed to be the only person receiving warnings. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but that explanation was getting harder to find. Then things became even stranger. A neighbor named Mark stopped me while I was checking my mailbox. Mark was friendly, easygoing, and usually avoided community drama. He looked around before speaking, almost as if he wanted to make sure nobody was listening. He asked whether I was planning to attend the upcoming HOA meeting. When I told him yes, he hesitated. Then he said something that immediately got my attention. According to Mark, several residents had been told that I had overreacted during a neighborhood situation and caused unnecessary trouble for everyone. I asked who was saying that. He did not answer directly. Instead, he gave me a look that told me everything I needed to know. The story circulating through the community was growing, and somehow I had become the villain in it. That evening, I started receiving fewer friendly messages from neighbors and more curious ones. People wanted to know what had really happened. A few seemed cautious when they spoke to me, as if they were trying to determine whether the rumors were true. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Someone was shaping the narrative before the meeting even happened. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one was delivered physically rather than electronically. Inside was a formal notice indicating that fines could be assessed if the listed violations remained unresolved. I read the document twice. Then a third time. The language sounded unusually aggressive for issues that had never previously been considered problems. What bothered me most was the timing. The special HOA meeting was only days away. The notices were increasing. The pressure was increasing. The rumors were increasing. Everything seemed to be building towards something. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing every email Deborah had sent since our conversation. One detail stood out immediately. Each communication became slightly more forceful than the one before it. It felt less like routine enforcement and more like a campaign. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being targeted and started asking why Deborah seemed so determined to make an example out of me. I still did not have the answer, but I had a growing suspicion that the upcoming meeting was going to reveal exactly how far she was willing to go. The special HOA meeting was still 2 days away, but by that point it felt as if the meeting had already started. Everywhere I went in the neighborhood, I could feel people watching and quietly forming opinions. The most frustrating part was that nobody seemed willing to say exactly what they had heard. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became less frequent. Even the usual weekend activity around the community felt different. One afternoon, I walked to the neighborhood mailbox station and noticed 2 residents lowering their voices the moment I approached. As soon as I arrived, they suddenly found reasons to leave. It was awkward enough that even they seemed embarrassed. Later that evening, I received a text from a neighbor named Lisa, someone I had always gotten along with. She asked if I was doing okay. The question seemed harmless until she followed it with another one. She asked whether I really intended to keep fighting the HOA. The wording caught my attention immediately. Fighting the HOA? I had not filed lawsuits. I had not organized complaints. I had not attended board meetings demanding change. All I had done was make one phone call and respond to violation notices. Yet somehow the story had evolved into something much bigger. I asked Lisa where she had heard that description. Her answer only increased my concern. According to her, several residents believed I was trying to create conflict within the community and embarrass neighborhood leadership. That was the first time I realized how effectively the narrative had been reframed. The issue was no longer what happened on the day I called 911. The issue had become whether I was a troublemaker. The following morning, I opened the resident portal again. A new agenda had been posted for the upcoming meeting. Most of it looked routine until I reached a section labeled Community Conduct Concerns. No names were listed, but something told me exactly where this was headed. Then I noticed another detail. Residents were encouraged to attend because the board would be discussing matters affecting community reputation. The phrase sounded familiar. It was almost identical to the language Deborah had used when she confronted me outside my house. That could have been a coincidence. But at this point, I was running out of reasons to believe in coincidences. Later that day, Mark stopped by unexpectedly. He looked more uncomfortable than usual. He told me that he had overheard a conversation involving one of the board members. Apparently, there was confidence that the upcoming meeting would settle the situation once and for all. When I asked what that meant, Mark shook his head. He did not know. What he did know was that several people seemed convinced the board was about to present information that would make me look bad in front of the entire neighborhood. That revelation changed everything. Until then, I had assumed the meeting would simply be another opportunity for Deborah to criticize me. Now I began to suspect something more organized was taking place. As the meeting drew closer, I could not shake the feeling that I was walking into a room where the verdict had already been decided. The only thing I did not know was how far Deborah was prepared to go to make sure everyone accepted her version of the story. The night of the meeting arrived, and before I even walked through the doors of the community clubhouse, I could tell the atmosphere was different. The parking lot was fuller than usual. Residents who normally skipped HOA meetings had shown up. Small groups stood outside talking quietly, and several conversations stopped the moment I passed by. That alone told me that whatever story had been circulating over the previous week had spread far beyond a handful of neighbors. When I entered the meeting room, nearly every seat was occupied. Deborah Collins stood near the front speaking confidently with board members. She looked completely comfortable, like someone who knew exactly how the evening was going to unfold. I took a seat near the middle of the room and waited. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting followed a normal agenda. Landscaping updates, budget items, maintenance schedules. Nothing unusual. Then Deborah reached the section labeled Community Conduct Concerns. The room immediately became quieter. Deborah began by talking about the importance of preserving neighborhood reputation. She spoke about responsible decision-making, community trust, and avoiding actions that could create unnecessary disruption. At first, she did not mention me by name. Then she gradually shifted toward a recent incident that had allegedly caused concern among residents. Within moments, everyone knew who she was talking about. Deborah carefully presented the situation in a way that made me sound reckless and irresponsible. According to her version of events, unnecessary outside attention had been brought into the neighborhood because certain residents had acted without gathering proper information. She never directly accused me of lying, but she did something almost as effective. She repeatedly suggested that poor judgment had created avoidable problems for the community. Each statement was worded carefully enough to sound reasonable while still pushing people toward a specific conclusion. Then came the part that surprised me most. Several residents began speaking in support of her comments. One person mentioned concerns about maintaining property values. Another talked about protecting the neighborhood's image. A third suggested that residents should communicate with HOA leadership before involving outside agencies whenever possible. As I listened, I realized how successful Deborah had been. The discussion was no longer about what had actually happened. The discussion was about the consequences she claimed had resulted from my actions. Every comment moved the conversation further away from the original event and closer to the narrative she wanted everyone to believe. Eventually, Deborah invited me to respond. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I explained that I had acted in good faith based on what I observed and that I believed contacting emergency services had been the responsible choice under the circumstances. My explanation was calm and factual. Yet the reaction in the room told me I was losing. Not because people had evidence against me, but because Deborah had spent days shaping perceptions before I ever had the chance to speak. Several residents exchanged skeptical looks. Others appeared unconvinced. By the time the discussion ended, Deborah looked completely in control. The board moved on to the next agenda item as if the matter had been settled. Walking out of that meeting, I experienced something I had not felt since this situation began. Doubt. For the first time, I wondered whether Deborah had already won. She had the board behind her, much of the neighborhood seemed to trust her version of events, and I had no way to prove what was really happening. What I did not know was that less than 24 hours later, a single unexpected message would completely change the direction of the entire story. The morning after the meeting felt strangely quiet. In some ways, that made everything worse. The tension that had been building for days seemed to have settled into something more permanent. Deborah had controlled the room, the board appeared satisfied, and most residents had left believing they understood exactly what had happened. As far as the community was concerned, the story was over. I went through my normal routine, trying to focus on work, but my attention kept drifting back to the meeting. Every time I replayed it in my head, I reached the same conclusion. Deborah had not needed proof. She had only needed confidence, repetition, and an audience willing to trust her. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. Normally I ignored messages from unfamiliar contacts, but something made me open this one. The message was short. I saw what happened at the meeting. There is something you should know. There was no name attached. For a moment I considered deleting it. Then another message arrived. Call me when you can. A phone number followed. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside and made the call. The woman who answered introduced herself as Emily Turner. I recognized the name immediately. Emily lived several streets away and rarely attended HOA events. We had spoken only a handful of times over the years. Her voice sounded nervous. She explained that she had attended the meeting and felt uncomfortable with how the discussion unfolded. That alone was interesting, but it was what she said next that got my full attention. According to Emily, there were details being left out of the story, details that very few people knew about. She asked if I remembered exactly where the original incident had occurred. Of course I did. Then she asked whether I knew that one of the homes near that location had recently upgraded its exterior security system. I paused. I had no idea where she was going with this. Emily explained that her friend lived near the entrance of the subdivision and had installed multiple high-definition cameras covering the street, sidewalks, and common areas. At first, I assumed she was simply telling me that footage might exist. That possibility alone was interesting. But Emily continued. Her friend had apparently become aware of the controversy spreading through the neighborhood and had reviewed some recordings after hearing conflicting stories about what happened. My heart immediately started racing. For the first time since this situation began, there was a possibility that something objective existed. Not opinions. Not rumors. Not HOA statements. Actual footage. I asked whether her friend had seen anything important. Emily hesitated before answering. Then she told me something that instantly changed my outlook. Her friend believed the recordings captured interactions connected to the events that led to the entire dispute. More importantly, what appeared on the footage did not match the version of events that had been repeated at the meeting. Suddenly, the confidence Deborah displayed the night before looked very different. If what Emily was saying was true, then someone in the neighborhood possessed information capable of challenging everything that had been presented as fact. I ended the call with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. For the first time since making that 911 call, I no longer felt trapped. Somewhere in the neighborhood, there might be evidence that could change everything. For the rest of that day, I could not think about anything except the conversation with Emily Turner. After weeks of rumors, accusations, and carefully managed narratives, the possibility that actual footage existed felt almost unreal. Still, I forced myself to stay cautious. I had already seen how quickly assumptions could become accepted as facts in our neighborhood. I did not want to repeat the same mistake. Later that afternoon, Emily arranged a meeting with her friend, a homeowner named Daniel Brooks. Daniel lived near the entrance of the subdivision, only a short distance from where the original incident had taken place. When I arrived at his house, he seemed reluctant to get involved. He made it clear that he did not enjoy neighborhood drama and had no interest in taking sides. In fact, the only reason he agreed to speak with me was because he was uncomfortable with how many conflicting stories were circulating through the community. We sat down in his living room, and Daniel explained that he had recently installed a multi-camera security system after a series of minor property concerns in the area. The cameras recorded continuously and covered several angles around the entrance road and nearby common spaces. As he spoke, I could feel my anticipation building. Then Daniel said something unexpected. He had already reviewed portions of the recordings. Not because he was looking for evidence, but because neighbors kept discussing the situation and he became curious about what had actually happened. I immediately asked what he found. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at me for a moment and said that what he saw raised serious questions about the version of events presented at the HOA meeting. My pulse quickened. For weeks, Deborah had acted as though the facts were completely settled. She spoke with certainty. She encouraged others to trust her account. She built an entire narrative around the idea that I had behaved irresponsibly. Yet here was someone with no obvious reason to support me telling me that the footage suggested otherwise. Even then, Daniel remained careful. He explained that he wanted to review everything again before sharing conclusions. He did not want anyone claiming that he had rushed to judgment. I respected that approach, but it also made the wait even harder. Before I left, he promised to examine the recordings more thoroughly and contact me within a day or two. Walking back to my car, I felt something I had not experienced in weeks. Hope. It was still possible that the footage would reveal nothing useful. It was possible that Daniel was mistaken. But for the first time, the story no longer felt completely controlled by Deborah. There was now an independent source of information, and that alone changed the balance. The following evening felt longer than any day I could remember. Every notification on my phone grabbed my attention. Every unknown number made me wonder whether Daniel had reached a conclusion. Then, shortly after 7 o'clock, his name finally appeared on my screen. I answered immediately. Daniel sounded far more serious than he had during our first meeting. He told me he had finished reviewing the recordings. Then he said a sentence that instantly made my stomach drop. "Ryan, I think you need to see this for yourself." At that moment, I knew whatever appeared in those recordings was significant enough to change the course of everything that had happened since that single phone call. Less than 30 minutes after Daniel called, I was sitting in his living room staring at a monitor connected to his security system. The moment I arrived, I could tell this was no longer a matter of speculation. Daniel had reviewed the footage multiple times. Emily was there as well, sitting quietly near the kitchen table. Neither of them looked excited. They looked concerned. Daniel loaded a recording from the day everything started and began playing it. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Cars entered and exited the neighborhood. Residents walked dogs. People went about their normal routines. Then the timeline reached the period just before I made the call that had triggered the entire controversy. Daniel paused the video and pointed toward the screen. A familiar figure appeared near the entrance area. It was Deborah Collins. I immediately leaned forward. According to the narrative repeated throughout the neighborhood, Deborah had portrayed herself as someone reacting to events after they occurred. She had repeatedly implied that outside involvement created unnecessary disruption. But that was not what the footage showed. The recording captured Deborah observing the situation that had concerned several residents. She was present far earlier than most people realized. We continued watching. Over the next several minutes, the footage showed Deborah remaining in the area, speaking with individuals nearby, and clearly demonstrating awareness of what was happening. Then came the moment that changed everything. The video showed another resident expressing concern and gesturing toward the situation. Deborah responded, and although the camera did not record audio, her actions were unmistakable. She dismissed the concern and encouraged people to move along. Daniel then switched to footage from a second camera angle. This view provided an even clearer timeline. Deborah was not someone who learned about events afterward. She was already there, already aware, and already interacting with people before emergency services were ever contacted. Suddenly, her statements at the HOA meeting took on an entirely different meaning. The issue had never been that she lacked information. The footage suggested she possessed more information than almost anyone else. As we continued reviewing recordings, another contradiction emerged. During the meeting, Deborah had strongly implied that residents acted irresponsibly by involving outside authorities. Yet the timeline demonstrated that significant time passed while concerns were being raised without meaningful action being taken. I sat there in stunned silence. Weeks of pressure, violation notices, rumors, and public criticism had all been built around a version of events that no longer made sense. Daniel finally paused the recording and looked at me. "This is why I wanted you to see it yourself," he said. "I did not want to describe it. I wanted you to understand the timeline." He was right. The footage did not merely challenge Deborah's narrative. It completely reframed it. For the first time, there was objective evidence showing that key parts of the story presented to residents were, at best, seriously incomplete. Emily broke the silence by asking the question that was now impossible to ignore. If Deborah knew as much as the footage suggested, why had she worked so hard to shift attention onto me? None of us had an answer. But one thing was suddenly clear. Deborah's authority depended on controlling the story, and the recordings had just taken that control away. The only question now was what would happen when the rest of the neighborhood saw what we had seen. The next challenge was deciding what to do with the footage. Seeing it myself had changed everything, but simply possessing information was not enough. For weeks, Deborah Collins had been the most trusted voice in the neighborhood. If the recordings were going to make a difference, people needed to see them in a way that could not be dismissed as rumor or personal opinion. Daniel understood that immediately. He was careful, methodical, and determined to handle the situation responsibly. Before sharing anything, he reviewed the recordings again and documented the timeline in detail. Emily helped organize key moments so that residents could easily follow what happened and when it happened. The more closely we examined the footage, the stronger the contradictions became. None of us needed to add commentary. The timeline spoke for itself. Within days, word began spreading that new information had surfaced. At first, only a few residents knew. Then more people started asking questions. Several board members reportedly requested an opportunity to review the recordings privately before the next HOA gathering. That alone was significant. Up until that point, most board members had accepted Deborah's version of events without much resistance. Now they were asking for evidence. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time since this started, Deborah was no longer controlling every conversation. When the next community meeting was announced, attendance surged again. Residents who had skipped previous meetings suddenly wanted to be there. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt completely different from the meeting where I had been criticized. Instead of quiet confidence, there was uncertainty. Instead of assumptions, there were questions. Deborah entered the room with the same composed demeanor she always projected, but something seemed different. She appeared aware that people were no longer accepting statements at face value. Early in the meeting, routine business moved quickly. Everyone knew why they were there. Eventually, one of the board members addressed the issue directly and announced that additional information had been provided regarding recent events discussed at the previous gathering. The room became silent. Daniel was invited to explain the existence of the security recordings. He carefully described the camera system, the recording process, and the timeline verification. His presentation was factual and measured. No accusations. No emotional speeches. Just documented information. Then key portions of the footage were shown. The reaction was immediate. Residents who had previously nodded along with Deborah's explanations now watched in complete silence. The recordings established facts that could not easily be reconciled with the narrative many people had been told. Faces around the room changed as the timeline became clear. Several people exchanged confused looks. Others began reviewing printed notes from the previous meeting. A board member asked questions about specific statements that had been made earlier. Another requested clarification regarding the sequence of events. For the first time, Deborah found herself responding instead of directing the discussion. She attempted to explain the discrepancies, but each explanation seemed to create new questions. Residents who had defended her position only weeks earlier now appeared uncertain. The confidence that once filled the room had shifted entirely. By the end of the meeting, the focus was no longer on my actions. Nobody was discussing whether I had created problems for the neighborhood. The discussion centered on why residents had received an incomplete picture of what happened. Walking out of the clubhouse that evening felt surreal. The story that had defined the community for weeks had been turned upside down. Yet despite everything that changed that night, the most dramatic consequences were still ahead, because the board now had to decide what to do about the person who had spent so much time shaping the narrative in the first place. In the days following that meeting, the atmosphere throughout the neighborhood changed more dramatically than I thought possible. For weeks, people had viewed the situation through the lens Deborah Collins provided. Now they were re-evaluating everything. Residents who had avoided me suddenly started saying hello again. Others approached me directly to ask questions or apologize for assumptions they had made. What struck me most was not that opinions were changing. It was how quickly they changed once people had access to verified information instead of speculation. Meanwhile, the HOA board faced growing pressure to address the inconsistencies that had been revealed. Questions continued arriving from residents. Some wanted to know why violation notices had escalated so aggressively. Others wanted clarification regarding statements made during the previous meeting. The board could no longer dismiss those concerns because the discussion was now centered on documented facts rather than competing stories. About 2 weeks later, a formal board session was held. Unlike earlier meetings, this one felt unusually tense. The confidence Deborah had displayed for months was gone. Several board members appeared determined to establish a complete record of what had occurred. During the discussion, the sequence of events was reviewed in detail. The timeline created from the recordings was compared against prior communications, meeting statements, and HOA actions. One inconsistency led to another. Then another. With each new review, it became increasingly difficult to explain how the situation had been handled. Deborah attempted to defend her decisions, arguing that she acted in the community's best interests. But the issue was no longer whether her intentions were good. The issue was whether residents had been given an accurate understanding of events. That was a much harder position to defend. By the end of the session, the board announced several decisions. The violation notices issued against me would be withdrawn. Any related penalties would be cancelled. Procedures for future enforcement actions would be reviewed. Additional transparency measures would also be implemented regarding communications with residents. Those announcements alone represented a complete reversal from where things stood only a few weeks earlier. Then came the development that few people had expected. Deborah stepped down from her leadership role shortly afterward. Officially, the decision was presented as a personal choice. Unofficially, most residents understood what had happened. Authority depends on trust, and once trust is damaged, titles become much less powerful. The same community that had once accepted her explanations without question was now demanding accountability from everyone involved. As for me, the strangest part of the experience was realizing how close I had come to accepting defeat. There was a point when I genuinely believed the narrative surrounding me would never change. The rumors seemed too widespread. The pressure felt too organized. The support behind Deborah appeared too strong. Yet the entire situation shifted because of one thing, evidence that nobody expected would matter. Looking back, I learned something valuable about communities, organizations, and people in positions of authority. Most conflicts are not decided by who speaks the loudest or who holds the highest title. They are decided by facts that can withstand scrutiny. In the end, my original decision to report a situation that concerned me was never the real issue. The real issue was what happened afterward and how far someone was willing to go to control the story. Ironically, the effort to manage that story created the very outcome Deborah had spent weeks trying to avoid. The truth eventually reached the neighborhood, and once it did, everything changed.